Hey guys, welcome to the 4th episode of my class series. Great to be working on these videos. They're actually my favorite ones to make as of late, and I'm glad to see them doing so well. Last episode we talked about marksmen, breaking down why it feels like they're becoming less and less useful despite being the class capable of dealing the most damage. And today, let's look at the opposite side, the class that is capable of receiving the most amount of damage, tanks. The first 3 episodes we talked about feature 3 out of the 4 DPS classes you would see in the Holy Trinity: tank, healer, and DPS. Naturally, DPS is the most popular role because people enjoy being the hero of the story. Nothing wrong with that, I myself really enjoy playing fighters, but as a result, it can lead to lopsided distribution of credit between the 3 roles. Tanks and healers are given much less recognition, which is ironic because they're just as critical to a party's ability to function, if not more than the actual damage dealers. Regardless, it's no surprise that tanks are among the least popular class to play in the game. Just like in other titles, the main job of a tank is to soak up damage. They're extremely resilient and can absorb massive amounts of pressure from enemies so that their squishy teammates don't have to. In PvP games, however, there's a slightly different role they occupy compared to traditional PvE. If you played an MMORPG, you'll know that tanks usually come armed with abilities that draw the enemy's attention, also known as aggro, or they create huge shields for their allies to protect them from giant attacks from large enemies or raid bosses. In MOBAs, which is what League is, drawing aggro is difficult to do since you're handling players, not algorithms. Some of them still carry defensive measures to protect against enemy threats, but the vast majority of tanks serve a much more specific purpose for their team. Out of all classes in League of Legends, tanks are equipped with the most amount of engage and hard crowd control. More importantly, they come with the strongest crowd control, as in wider radius, longer duration, things like that. While the game pits 5 champions against 5 champions rather than a massive party against one boss, tanks are super important to have in a team comp because they're effectively a one-stop shop for when you need someone to just get in there and kick some ass. Just like fighters and slayers, there are 2 subclasses of tanks, Vanguards and Wardens. Very simple distinction between the two. Vanguards are offensive tanks and Wardens are defensive tanks. Technically speaking, there's no such thing as aggressive or defensive hard crowd control. A stun is a stun and a knockup is a knockup. Comparatively, they have very similar strengths and weaknesses. Both are incredibly sturdy and generally slow. Even though many of them come with dashes, they're not too fast or slippery, and their attacks can be a little more clunky or sluggish. And if it wasn't obvious at this point, all tanks are melee. What their subclasses mean by offense and defense is that Vanguards are the ones that go in. As their name suggests, they're the first ones to get into a fight. If you look at the champions on this list, they're definitely the ones that bring some much needed engage for their team. Vanguards do have more lockdown potential than Wardens, since it's not uncommon for them to have 2, 3, or even some cases 4 instances of hard crowd control. They carry enough to where even if the rest of the team has no slows, roots, stuns, or anything, it's still enough to usually keep the enemy team at bay. But apart from hard CC, they don't really do that much when it comes to protecting anyone else. Wardens do though. They're usually equipped with 1 or 2 abilities that offer protection for their allies, such as shields or even interceptors that can stop enemies from attacking or getting towards them. But don't make the mistake of thinking they can't deal enough damage because aside from Taric and Braum, the other 4 can dish out just as much pain as Vanguards can if you don't pay attention to them. Mind you, they're still tanks, so they don't come anywhere close to the level of hurt as actual DPS classes. Or can they? Despite the archetype being known for the low capacity for damage, League of Legends tends to run into situations where tanks seem to output an unusually high amount of DPS relative to their survivability, outstripping even fighters in both parameters even though the latter excels against tanks for that very reason. This has been a major point of concern for balance. We've seen 3 separate tank metas take place in the span of 5 years. The most recent tank meta we've had was the start of preseason 11 when Sunfire Aegis was so insanely overpowered along with just about every defensive item being super gold efficient. Shortly afterwards, they nerfed that item and buffed Turbo Chem Tank, which caused a different tank meta to take place where Hecarim and Udyr were both running around with 600 move speed while being unkillable and dealing crazy damage. Tank metas can be pretty terrifying because how the hell are you supposed to take one of them down, let alone the rest of their team? So, that brings us to this class's video discussion topic. Do tanks deal too much damage? And to, I guess, add on to that, why does it feel like they have so much damage and do they need to do a lot of damage? The short answer for the first part, yes, tanks do far more damage than they have in the past. As for why they're doing so much damage and if they need to, it comes down to a few factors, so I'll go through one of them at a time. For obvious reasons, tanks don't build damage items since they don't have the speed or scaling to make use of them effectively. Also, they tend to have 1 or 2 abilities in their kit that benefit from building health, armor, and/or magic resist. As a result, they normally have to rely on their base damage to get by, especially in the early to mid game. Thing is, tanks have high base damage since they still need to be able to wave clear and remain a threat besides being just a giant meat wall. Unlike attack damage and ability power which scale linearly, armor and magic resist scales multiplicatively up to a cap since they reduce damage by a percentage and not a flat amount. This is often why you see tanks like Scion, Ornn, and Maokai suddenly be able to win trades against you with Bramble Vest and Tabbies when just a few minutes ago you were out-brawling them as Renekton or Wukong. But a 6-item Nunu doesn't seem that much tankier than a 5-item Nunu due to diminishing returns. Because they're able to take multiple beatings before going down, tanks can go through their ability rotations several times over. And while they can take a lot of hits, fighters can't, not as much anyway, since their first items usually only provide health at most. That same interaction applies even more to marksmen, mages, and assassins who have zero resistances early on. And it's not until 3 or 4 items when DPS champions finally have more damage than tanks can reduce it. In other words, tanks are really weak prior to their first item and boots because they have no armor or magic resist or health to be tanky. They're often just as squishy as everyone else, level 1, 2, 3, and such. But in the mid game, when they get their first 2 or 3 defensive items, they have much higher resilience than carries do damage. Then in the late game, they start to fall off because armor and magic resist get much less effective the higher you go, and DPS champs start to buy armor and magic pen items or can finally out-sustain tank damage with lifesteal, heals, shields, etc. That's the biggest reason AD carries feel like tanks are too broken, because they have a super strong mid game while marksmen have pretty much the weakest mid game out of all classes. So then if that's such a problem, why not reduce base damage on tanks across the board so they can't just brute force their way through? That's where things get a bit tricky. Conceptually, tanks cannot carry. That's the issue. They cannot carry because they're not meant to carry. They're also not essential to a team in this game the way they are in others because 1, you can't draw aggro from players. It's not like you can cast a spell in-game and all of a sudden the person in real life has this rapid fixation for attacking you and only you. 2, League doesn't have raid bosses or big bads that require a fully stacked party of like 30 dudes to work together to take down. There's no champion or enemy in League who can do catastrophic damage to everyone that can only be protected by a Braum or Taric. Well, I guess if you time it properly you can stop a Misfortunal, but you know what I mean, right? Like there's no super big AoE attack that you have to worry about from Baron or Dragon. In PvE games, tanks were just as much of a carry as the carries themselves because they literally could not survive without one. In League, there's no integral need for a tank. What are the 2 things they provide to a team? Crowd control and pressure absorption. Nowadays, there's a lot of fighters and even slayers who come armed with plenty of hard CC, just like a Qiyana who has a massive AoE stun on her ultimate for an assassin, or Yone's Q and ultimate which has huge area coverage. Skirmishers too, Riven with an AoE knockup on her Q and stun on her W. Lilia can get a 5-man sleep with a single usage of Q and ultimate. A team's quota for lockdown or displacement can be easily met by non-tanks. And in terms of pressure absorption, fighters can do that to a similar extent while dealing massively more damage. Now, do those other classes have the same efficiency or reliability as tanks? No. You can't look at a Jax or Darius and expect them to frontline just as much as a Zac or a Sejuani, nor can they come anywhere close to the level of crowd control, but they don't have to. All the CC in the world, all the durability in the world does not matter if you can't kill your opponent. There's nothing a tank does that can't be done by other classes, which points to the adage, the best defense is a strong offense. You don't need to worry about surviving enemy attacks if you kill them first. Most of the time, a team can just get by with Leona, Nautilus, or Alistar support. It's kind of unnecessary to have more than one Vanguard or Warden per team at this point. Additionally, ever since the dreaded tank meta from Season 5 to Season 7, Riot has made a lot of attempts to add ways to stop tanks from sweeping games at all stages. We have far more access to tank busters than we've ever had before. Divine Sunderer, Eclipse, Krakenslayer, Leandri's Anguish, Riftmaker, Black Cleaver, Blade of the Ruined King, Demonic Embrace, Lord Dominic's Regards, Cyrilda's Grudge, Voidstaff. There are 11 items in the game that have some property within them that contests health, armor, and or magic resist. Champions as well. Ever since Season 6, we had so many new releases and reworks who have built-in tank busters. In terms of new ones, Gwen, Viego, Yone, Lilia, Set, Senna, Kaisa, Zoe, Red King, Camille, and Kled. In terms of reworks, Volibear, Fiddlesticks, Wukong, Pantheon, Mordekaiser, Kayle, Urgot, Shen, and Poppy. All of these champions have some combination of true damage, percent health damage, armor, or magic penetration simply by default. These aspects were present long before, but not on this many champions. Even though tanks have a very strong mid-game, they're also the class with the most counters in both items and champions. Locking in a tank first pick in top or jungle is practically suicide when there's a plethora of champions that can tear you to shreds, and even super late game brutes like Sion, Cho'Gath, and Zac can be reduced to ashes once the enemy AD carry gets Kraken Slayer and LDR. In a way, tanks face the same issue as marksmen, where power and feature creep are gradually pushing them out of relevance since other champions can come reasonably close to fulfilling their roles but with much more independence and efficiency. If you've been paying close attention to pro play, you'll notice team compositions where top, jungle, mid, and ADC were all high-pressure DPS champs. Why bother picking Malphite for his ultimate when Wukong has the same kind of ultimate but with way more damage and carry potential? Why bother picking Maokai to lock down the enemy ADC when you can pick Camille and one-shot them all together? Because Riot implemented so many ways to prevent tank meta from ever happening again, they ended up overcorrecting and making it too easy to stop tanks. So, in an effort to maintain personal agency and to incentivize players to pick tanks, they had only one option: give them more damage. The whole thing with tanks before is that they took 5 years to kill, so they didn't do that much damage because they also had 5 years to slowly chip away at their opponent. Now, even the 7000 HP 300 armor Cho'Gath gets melted in 5 seconds, so they have to be able to dish out damage much more quickly. Only way to do that is to reduce their cooldowns to make their attacks more spammable or give them way more base damage. I can think of 2 noteworthy examples off the top of my head. The first is the buff Malphite received on his W. He was always known for having massive amounts of armor and getting stronger with armor, but in patch 7.19, he got this completely random buff where Granite Shield tripled the bonus armor on his W, which could give him up to 90% bonus armor, and that also made him deal more damage. This was added to keep up with the growing number of top laners that could counter him with % health damage or Black Cleaver. The second change was when Sunfire Cape got that extra passive where landing hard crowd control did an extra burst of magic damage, and they didn't extract that damage from anywhere else, it was added for free. Sunfire Aegis took it a step further by making it so you deal that burst of damage with every single attack on no cooldown, while increasing the passive burn damage. These buffs were instated so that tanks could deal their damage more quickly, and across the board a ton of them receive boosts to their base stats and cooldown reductions so that they can still impose some pressure even in the late game. Riot is trying way too hard to turn a non-carry class into a carry class simply because every class is now becoming a carry class. The reason Leona and Nautilus deal more damage than their ADC is due to the fact that there's nothing else they have going for them other than that, or in situations where their ADC is feeding, they can still somewhat do the damage on their own. There's no need for a tank's massive amount of hard crowd control when a ton of hyper carry champions have stuns and knockups these days. There's no need for their massive durability since it's either super easy to take them down or assassins and skirmishers can just go right around them and take out their carries, so the only way they can be relevant is through more damage. Before, Thornmail used to be a late game item purchase when ADCs were doing a lot of damage per auto, so they would also take a lot of damage. But when Bramblevest came out and they added Grievous Wounds to it, it became such an effective first buy because Bramblevest not only dealt quite a decent amount of damage against basic attackers, but the anti-heal sabotaged their sustain, by extension dealing more damage. Now admittedly, tanks can be quite boring to play. Their sluggish and clunky nature inherently makes them easy to play mechanically, and while some tanks can make sick plays like Rel, they're not exactly as exciting as Slayers or Fighters because even though I talked about how they're doing so much more damage these days, they're still not a carry class. Tanks aren't meant to carry. If they could, they would be the strongest class in the game. Being invincible while one-shotting everyone isn't exactly good game balance. I think the class itself is in a really bad spot. They have such a vital role in teamfights but get none of the glory. On the other hand, if they try to force the enemy team to respect them, people will start complaining that they're overtuned, broken, and deal too much damage. Essentially, tanks can never be popular because then they're overpowered. But if they're not overpowered, then no one wants to play them because they're just not that fun to play. Season 11 brought back tank meta for a few months after tanks in top and jungle were more or less not the best for the past 2 to 3 years, but people immediately got upset at it because every tank had like a 54% win rate and we had to worry about Hecarim and Udyr just absolutely myrtleizing everybody. I don't know, it's tough to figure out how to give tanks more agency to be more enjoyable to play without everyone hating on them for being so brain dead easy. On the plus side, they are doing great as supports. Nautilus, Leona, Alistar, and such have been able to comfortably share a space with enchanters like Lulu, Karma, and Yuumi. But that also poses the question of whether or not tanks are relegated to being strictly supports or just whatever you pick when you're autofill top. Anyways, we're getting kind of long, so I'll end it off here. Let me know what your thoughts are on tanks in the comment section down below. If you think they're fine as is or if you think they do too much damage. But if you enjoyed the video, a rating would be much appreciated. Sub to the channel if you want to see more content like this. consider joining me on my Discord server or following me on my socials. Also, I have 3 other episodes on fighters, slayers, and marksmen if you want to check them out. That's it for today though. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll hopefully see you again soon. Take care.